Call Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, a slightly strange feeling for me standing up and to speak in favour of a government bill. It's something that we don't get to do very often on this side of the House. And it is nice to be able to support one of the initiatives the government has in place, because the interest-free student loan scheme is one that I'm particularly proud of, one that the previous Labor government is particularly proud of. Good to see that the National Party have come around to it, albeit probably temporarily, but we hope that they will continue to support the interest-free student loan scheme. It's also one of the pieces of legislation that we actually think that there is a compelling case for doing in a bit of a hurry because of the looming deadlines involved in this piece of legislation. Unlike some of the other pieces of legislation that have gone through the House under this current somewhat shambolic urgency session. And in fact, I'm pleased that the Minister managed to get to the House in time to do his second reading speech, only just because we nearly missed the opportunity to debate it all together. And I'm pleased that he made it here. I think he probably wasn't expecting the government to completely mess up the procedural motions on the bill beforehand, so he would have had a little bit more time to get down here, and so he had to rush down. And I want to, on behalf of the House, thank him for getting here in time to be able to, so that we can actually debate this bill today as part of this urgency motion. Mr Speaker, I mentioned before that I was pleased that the government seemed to have come around to the idea of interest-free student loans. In fact, they seem to have come around to the idea of interest-free loans in general. And in fact, interest-free loans for ministers who use ministerial credit cards appears to be the order of the day at the moment. And I understand they're a man down on the other side of the House today, and the only real question is, will he pay interest? Will he pay interest on the money that he's paying back? As the government want to make students who leave the country pay interest on their student loans, will Phil Heatley have to pay interest on the credit card money that he's paying back? Mr Speaker, I find it ironic that we're here talking about the interest-free student loan scheme at a time when the government has already announced that they are going to be re-looking at all of the issues around student support. Because the question that's on the minds of all students at the moment is, what does that mean? Does that mean interest-free student loans are for the chop? Does it mean that our allowances are for the chop? Does it mean that the fees are going to go up? They don't know, because the statements coming from John Key and Stephen Joyce are sufficiently vague that they would have no idea what's looming around the corner. So I'm concerned that the government are starting to soften the ground up to do away with interest-free student loans. They won't do it this term of Parliament. I'm pretty confident they won't do it this term of Parliament, but I don't have any confidence that they wouldn't do that in the next term of Parliament. Because when one looks at the comments that John Key made when the interest-free student loan scheme was introduced in the first place, it's pretty clear that he was fundamentally opposed to the idea. Because what did he say? He said, and I quote, "What a cost, what an unaffordable and irresponsible cost to the country," end quote. That was what John Key said when it was first announced. He called it rushed and reckless. And he said, and I quote, he said, "Our caucus would never have signed off a zero interest rate because the economies are just so bad. It has never been for us because we have standards." Well, I'm not sure that the government really wants to be talking about standards in education at the moment. Not today. I'm not sure they want to be talking about standards in very many areas today, although at least we have a question time today at 2 o'clock, hopefully. So I think that the government can expect a few more questions on standards in education at question time today. John Key said he was going to fight, as my colleague Grant Robertson said, he was going to fight interest-free student loans with every bone in his body. Well, we're still looking for the bones, because he said, because here we have in this Parliament a bill that actually extends some of the provisions of the interest-free student loan scheme. And they're actually sensible provisions. They're provisions that the Labour Party has supported and will continue to support, such as extending the interest-free student loans to borrowers who are present in Niue, the Cook Islands, Tokelau or the Ross dependency. And it also extends student loans, interest-free student loans for students who are enrolled with a New Zealand education provider and engaged in full-time study overseas, either under a formal exchange program approved by the government or a formal agreement between a New Zealand tertiary provider and an overseas tertiary provider. I just want to flag one issue for the Minister that I'm going to raise in the committee stage, which he may like some advance warning of, and that is that my understanding at the moment is that the interest-free student loans, while being extended to those studying overseas, at the moment covers diplomats living overseas on posting, but not their partners. So the partners of a diplomat who moves with the diplomat to move overseas on posting isn't eligible for an interest-free student loan, but the diplomat themselves is. And I think that's possibly an anomaly in the scheme that the government may want to think about correcting, because ultimately the partner is on posting as part of a government contingent as well, and I'm not sure that there should be a separation between whether or not they get an interest-free student loan if their partners are. Now, I haven't had time to check that out thoroughly, but I'm pretty confident that that is currently the case, and I think that's something that the government might like to look at, because it seems to me quite consistent with the goals of this bill, that that's something that could be addressed in the committee stages of the passage of this bill, because we want to make sure that all New Zealanders who meet the criteria for interest-free student loans are able to get them, and they're not disqualified based on a technicality. I want to come back again to John Key's statement in his prime ministerial statement earlier in the year that he was going to, quote, take a careful look at the policy settings around student support. And as I said, everybody wants to know what that means and where that leaves the interest-free student loans policy, because a lot of students will have heard the things that the national government have said about interest-free student loans in the past, and they'll be wanting to know, does this mean that interest is on the way back, or that other changes to the tertiary education system are likely that are going to leave them worse off? Because the National Party's track record on tertiary education isn't actually all that flash. And their track record of keeping their promises on tertiary education aren't all that flash. And I remember all the way back to 1990, in fact, when Lockwood Smith, I wasn't a tertiary student then, but I remember back that far, to the point where Lockwood Smith travelled the length and breadth of the country signing pledges saying that he was going to resign if student fees weren't abolished altogether. Over the next 9 years that the National Party were in government, in fact, student tuition fees massively increased, and they introduced the student loan scheme as the way to pay for it. So not only did they weasel out of the promise that they made to students, they then actually found another way to impose more and more cost on them, and that was how the student loan scheme came about. The student loan scheme itself, the whole loan scheme, is a result of a broken National Party election promise. So when people hear the National Party saying, well, we're not going to change the interest-free student loan scheme, I don't think that they're going to have much confidence in that when they also hear John Key saying things like they're going to take a careful look at the policy settings around student support, all of which points to the fact that they are actually looking at the issue. And last year, when challenged by the opposition, Bill English and Anne Tolley were challenged on whether or not they had asked the Treasury to look at the cost of abolishing the interest-free student loan scheme, or the potential revenue that they would gain from abolishing the student loan scheme. They did not deny that they had done so. And to this day, the National Party have not denied that they have asked the Treasury to put together the costings and the projections involved in removing the interest-free student loan scheme. And I think that's something that students up and down the country will be worried about, because interest-free student loan scheme, as I said at the beginning, is a policy that we on this side of the House are very proud of. It is allowing students to repay their loans much, much faster than they would have under the previous regime, where interest continued to mount where some students were struggling to even make the interest payments, let alone get into the principal of it. And of course, under the previous national government that existed prior to 1999, students were charged interest even while they were studying. So while they had no ability to earn any income to pay back the loans, they were still being charged interest. So their loan at the time of graduation was significantly more than they'd actually been required to borrow to pay for their fees or their living costs, because there was that cumulative interest over the 3 or 5 years in some cases that they had been studying. And we thought that was unfair. It was one of the first things the Labour government did away with. And we're pleased that the National Party have so far kept that. We're worried that the National Party appear to want to take that away, and that all of the things that they're doing are preparing the ground for the reintroduction of interest on student loans, for the imposition of further cost on tertiary students, which can only act as a barrier to us lifting the wage rate, lifting productivity in this country, lifting the economic standing of New Zealand, because an educated workforce is the way we do that, and interest-free student loans is an important part of the policy mechanism that we encourage people into tertiary study with.